My name is Penelope Ashford, and at 64 years old, I learned that sometimes you have to let someone think they're winning in order to watch them lose everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with the morning that changed everything, the morning my own son tried to extort me while I was dying. It was a Tuesday in October, one of those crisp autumn mornings when the light streaming through my breakfast room windows caught the Carrara marble countertops just so, creating patterns that reminded me of water flowing over stone. I was enjoying my usual breakfast of Earl Grey tea and perfectly buttered toast, reading the Wall Street Journal, and reviewing the overnight reports from my financial advisors, when the first stab of pain hit my chest. It wasn't a sharp, dramatic heart attack you see in movies. It was more like someone had wrapped a steel band around my ribcage and was slowly, methodically tightening it. My breath became shallow, then labored, then barely there at all. The newspaper slipped from my fingers as I gripped the edge of the marble counter, my vision blurring at the edges. That's when I heard Grant's key in the front door. My son had a key to my estate on Magnolia Hill, a privilege I'd granted him years ago when I still believed that blood meant something more than shared DNA. He'd been coming by more frequently lately, always with some excuse about checking on me, making sure I was taking care of myself. I'd thought it was sweet, this newfound concern for his aging mother. How naive I was. Grant's footsteps echoed through the marble foyer, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the stone in that confident stride I'd once been so proud of. He was calling out as he approached the breakfast room, his voice carrying that particular note of false cheer he used when he wanted something. "Mother? I brought those financial documents you wanted to review." He stopped dead when he saw me collapsed against the counter, my face pale, my breathing ragged. For just a moment, just a heartbeat, I saw something that might have been genuine concern flicker across his features. Then it was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating that I'd never seen before. Or perhaps I'd simply never allowed myself to see it. Grant didn't rush to help me. He didn't immediately call 911. Instead, he set his briefcase down with deliberate care and walked slowly around the kitchen island until he was standing directly in front of me, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne and see the designer watch glinting on his wrist, the watch I'd given him for his last birthday. Well, he said quietly, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard from him before. This is convenient timing. I tried to speak, to ask him to call for help, but all that came out was a strangled whisper. The pain in my chest was intensifying, spreading down my left arm with the textbook precision of a cardiac event. Grant knelt down so that his face was level with mine, his breath warm against my ear as he leaned close. What he said next will be burned into my memory until the day I actually die. "Make me the sole beneficiary of your fortune, or I'll let you die right here." The words hit me like ice water. I stared at my son, this man I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through countless illnesses, supported through law school, celebrated at his wedding, and saw a stranger, a predator who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Grant," I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. "Please call." "Call who?" he asked with mock innocence, pulling my phone from the counter and slipping it into his jacket pocket. "I don't see any reason to rush. We have time to discuss your estate planning while we wait." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He was holding my life hostage, using my medical emergency as leverage to steal my fortune. But what Grant didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that I'd been expecting something like this for weeks. Not the heart attack, of course, but the betrayal? The naked greed? That I'd seen coming. 3 weeks earlier, I'd overheard Grant and his wife Sloane discussing my assets in what they thought was an empty restaurant. Their voices had carried further than they'd realized, and I'd heard enough to understand that they viewed me not as family, but as an obstacle to their financial security. An obstacle that needed to be removed. That conversation had prompted me to take certain precautions. Among them was the installation of a state-of-the-art surveillance system throughout my home, including a tiny pin camera hidden in the crown molding of the breakfast room. Motion-activated, time-stamped, with high-fidelity audio that could pick up a whisper from across the room. Every word Grant had just spoken was being recorded and automatically uploaded to a secure cloud server that my attorney, Arthur Pennington, could access remotely. I forced the words out between labored breaths. Arthur Pennington. Call Arthur. Grant's smile was reptilian. I'll call Arthur after we reach an understanding about your will. You're going to change it, Mother.
Today. Right now.
Everything goes to me, with Sloan as secondary beneficiary. No trusts, no charities, no complicated legal structures. Just a simple transfer from mother to son. Please, I whispered, genuinely struggling now. The pain was radiating through my entire torso, and I could feel my heart beating irregularly against my ribs. Please what? Grant stood up, looking down at me with cold satisfaction. Please help you? Please call for medical assistance? I think you misunderstand our relationship, Mother. I'm not your dutiful son anymore. I'm your business partner, and we're about to negotiate the deal of my lifetime. That's when fate intervened in the form of Mrs. Harrison, my elderly neighbor who lived in the estate next door. She'd apparently heard the crash of my chair falling over when I'd first collapsed, and when she hadn't seen me in my garden at my usual time, she'd become concerned enough to walk over and knock on my front door. Penelope. I heard her voice calling from the foyer. Are you all right, dear? I thought I heard something. Grant's expression shifted instantly from predatory satisfaction to panicked concern. He grabbed my arm, not to help me, but to whisper urgently in my ear. Not a word about our conversation. Tell her you're fine, just a little dizzy. I'll be the perfect concerned son, and after she leaves, we'll finish our business. But Mrs. Harrison was persistent, and when I didn't answer, she did what any reasonable person would do. She called 911. The sound of sirens approaching was like music to my ears, though I was careful not to let my relief show on my face. Grant immediately shifted into performance mode, suddenly becoming the devoted son who'd found his mother in distress. Thank God you're here, he told the paramedics as they rushed into the breakfast room. I just arrived and found her like this. I was about to call for help. The EMT, a competent-looking man in his 40s, immediately began checking my vital signs while his partner prepared the gurney. As they worked, I managed to catch the first EMT's attention. Please, I whispered to him, my voice so quiet that Grant couldn't hear. Note this, he refused to call for help. Please write that down. The EMT's eyes flicked to Grant, then back to me. He nodded slightly and made a note on his chart, clicking his pen with deliberate emphasis. As they loaded me onto the gurney, Grant insisted on riding along in the ambulance, playing the role of the concerned son for the medical personnel. But I caught him checking his watch twice during the short ride to the hospital, and I heard him quietly rehearsing what he'd tell the doctors. Mama's been wanting me to take over her financial affairs. She's been getting forgetful lately, making poor decisions. He was already building his narrative, already planning how to use my medical emergency to gain control of my assets. What Grant didn't know was that I'd been building my own narrative for weeks. Every conversation had been recorded, every financial document secured, every potential vulnerability in my estate planning addressed with surgical precision. He thought pressure would win. He thought that by holding my life hostage, he could force me to rewrite 40 years of careful estate planning in his favor. He was wrong. Pressure doesn't win. Pressure reveals who needs breaking first. And as I lay on that gurney, listening to my son plan how to steal my fortune while I fought for my life, I made a promise to myself and to the memory of the boy he used to be. Grant wanted my estate? Fine. I'd give him exactly what he deserved, which was nothing but the satisfaction of watching his greed destroy him completely. The game was about to begin, and my son had no idea he was already losing. The cardiac care unit at Presbyterian Hospital became my temporary command center for what would prove to be the most satisfying campaign of my 64 years on this earth. The doctors had stabilized me quickly. It hadn't been a full heart attack, thank God, but rather what they called unstable angina, a warning shot that my cardiovascular system was under stress. Stress. If they only knew. I spent the first 18 hours hooked to monitors that beeped and hummed with mechanical precision, oxygen flowing through a cannula that made my voice sound thinner than usual, but didn't affect my mental clarity in the slightest. Grant and Sloan had maintained their vigil in the hallway, taking turns coming in to express their concern and ask pointed questions about my comfort, my prognosis, and most tellingly, my wishes for the future. Before we continue with Penelope's calculated revenge, let me pause to tell you something important. If you've ever been told you're too old to start over, let me tell you, that's a lie. Your story isn't over, and you still have chapters left to write. Our best-selling book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, is filled with simple, powerful steps to help you heal, rebuild, and fall in love with life again. Just like Penelope discovered her own strength at 64, you too have the power to rewrite your narrative. Click the link in the description box and start your new beginning today. Now, let's see how a woman who refused to be a victim became the architect of perfect justice. On the morning of my second day in the hospital, I made a decision that would change everything. I requested no visitors except my attorney, Arthur Pennington. The nurses were instructed to tell anyone else, including Grant, that I was resting and couldn't be disturbed. Arthur arrived at precisely 10 a.m., carrying his leather briefcase and wearing the same impeccably tailored navy suit he'd favored for the 30 years I'd known him. At 67, Arthur Pennington was a man who understood that preparation was the foundation of victory, and that precision was more powerful than passion. "Penelope," he said quietly, taking the chair beside my bed. "I've reviewed the footage from your breakfast room. We need to discuss our options." I handed him my phone with the passcode and watched his face as he accessed the cloud server where my home surveillance system stored its recordings. Arthur was not a man given to dramatic expressions, but I saw his jaw tighten as he watched Grant threaten to let me die unless I changed my will. When the video ended, Arthur was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at me with the calm, focused expression of a man preparing for war. "We go on offense," he said simply. Arthur pulled out a legal pad and began making notes as he outlined the situation. My estate planning was already sophisticated. We'd spent years building a structure designed to protect my assets from exactly the kind of attack Grant was attempting. The cornerstone was the 2019 Ashford Heritage Irrevocable Trust, domiciled in Wyoming for its favorable privacy laws. 85% of my assets had been moved into this trust 2 years earlier, with an independent corporate trustee managing the investments and distributions. Grant was listed as a beneficiary, but he had no control over the trust's operations and couldn't force distributions. The remaining 15% of my wealth sat in accounts at a private bank with robust security protocols, managed by Trent Albright, a senior trust officer who'd been handling high-net-worth clients for over 20 years. My healthcare proxy was current and specific, my HIPAA releases were properly executed, and most importantly, my will contained an ironclad no-contest clause. Anyone who challenged the estate plan would forfeit their inheritance entirely. "Grant doesn't understand trust law," Arthur explained as he reviewed my documents. "He thinks changing your will would give him immediate access to everything. He has no idea that most of your assets are beyond the reach of any will. So, his extortion attempt is pointless?"
Legally, yes.
"But that doesn't mean he won't try, and it doesn't mean he won't cause problems. We need to be proactive." Arthur's plan was elegantly simple. We would make Grant believe he was winning while systematically destroying his ability to steal anything. First, we would create a comprehensive set of decoy documents and sign drafts, sample power of attorney forms, and official-looking summaries that appeared to grant Grant sweeping authority over my affairs. These documents would be legally worthless, but Grant wouldn't understand the technicalities that made them invalid. Second, we would implement additional security measures at the private bank. Trent Albright would flag my accounts for suspected coercion, requiring in-person verification and multiple callback procedures for any significant transactions. Third, we would alert my life insurance companies to potential beneficiary change fraud, freezing any modifications until the coercion investigation was complete. Most importantly, Arthur said, we need fresh documentation of your mental competency and free will. The fact that Grant threatened you during a medical emergency gives us grounds to question any subsequent changes to your estate plan. I reached for the bedside table and pulled out a small digital recorder I'd asked the nurses to bring from my personal effects. Then let's create that documentation right now. For the next 30 minutes, I recorded a detailed video statement using Arthur's tablet. I was clear, articulate, and precise as I described Grant's threat, my current mental state, and my intentions regarding my estate plan. I specifically stated that any documents signed under duress should be considered invalid, and that my true wishes were reflected in the existing trust structure. Arthur uploaded the video to multiple secure servers and had it timestamped by a digital notary service. If Grant tried to claim I was incompetent or coerced, this recording would demolish his credibility. There's one more thing, Arthur said as he prepared to leave. This path leads to criminal charges. Elder abuse, extortion, possibly attempted fraud, depending on how far Grant pushes this. Are you prepared for that outcome? I thought about the little boy who used to curl up in my lap for bedtime stories, who'd once made me a Mother's Day card decorated with his tiny handprints. Then I thought about the man who'd threatened to let me die unless I rewrote my will in his favor. Arthur, I said quietly, that little boy died the moment he decided money was more important than his mother's life. What's left is a criminal who happens to share my last name. Make sure the handcuffs are tight. Arthur nodded and packed his briefcase with methodical precision. I'll coordinate with Maureen Klein on the trust security measures and with Trent Albright on the banking protocols. We'll also need to discuss bringing in law enforcement, but we should wait until Grant makes his next move. He will, I said with certainty. Greed makes people predictable. After Arthur left, I lay back against my pillows and watched the monitors trace the steady rhythm of my recovering heart. Grant thought he held all the cards: my medical vulnerability, my apparent isolation, my presumed desperation to secure his care and attention. He was about to learn that the most dangerous opponent is one who's had time to prepare for battle while appearing helpless. My phone buzzed with a text message from Grant. Hope you're feeling better, Mom. We should talk about those documents as soon as you're ready. No pressure, just want to make sure you're protected. I smiled as I typed my response. Come by tomorrow afternoon. Bring Sloan. I think it's time we had that conversation about the future. Grant replied immediately. Perfect. We'll take care of everything. Yes, I thought. You certainly will. By tomorrow evening, Grant would have enough rope to hang himself, and I would be there to watch him tie the knot. The discharge process from Presbyterian Hospital was a masterclass in performance art. Grant and Sloan arrived precisely at 11 a.m., both dressed in what I recognized as their concerned family costumes. Grant in a conservative charcoal suit that projected responsible sun energy, Sloan in a tasteful navy dress that suggested supportive daughter-in-law without being overly formal. They played their roles perfectly, fussing over my discharge instructions, insisting on reviewing my medications with a nurse, and making a show of helping me into the wheelchair despite my protests that I was perfectly capable of walking. We just want to make sure you're comfortable, Mother, Sloan said, her voice pitched at exactly the right level of loving concern. You gave us such a scare. I allowed them to fuss, playing the role of the grateful but fragile elderly mother who is touched by their devotion. It wasn't difficult. After 48 hours in a hospital bed, I genuinely did feel somewhat depleted, though my mind was sharper than ever. During the ride home in Grant's Mercedes, I floated the bait that would hook them completely. "I've been thinking," I said, my voice carefully modulated to sound tired but determined, "about what you said the other morning, Grant, about taking care of the future." Grant's eyes met mine in the rearview mirror, and I saw the predatory gleam he couldn't quite suppress. "What about it, Mom?" "I want peace," I continued, letting a slight tremor enter my voice. "I don't want to spend whatever time I have left worrying about legal complications or family disputes. Maybe it's time to simplify things." "That sounds very wise," Sloane said, turning in her seat to face me with an expression of earnest support. "What did you have in mind?" "A comprehensive review of my will and power of attorney arrangements. I want to make sure everything is clear, everything is in order. And I want both of you involved in the process, so there are no misunderstandings later." The look that passed between Grant and Sloane was electric with triumph. They thought they'd won. They thought my medical scare had made me compliant, grateful, ready to hand over control of my fortune in exchange for their continued care and attention. They had no idea they were walking into a trap that had been months in the making. I pulled out my phone and called Arthur's office while they listened. "Arthur? It's Penelope. I'm ready to move forward with that estate planning review we discussed. Could you schedule a pre-signing meeting for tomorrow? I'd like Grant and Sloane to be present so they understand exactly what we're planning." Arthur, bless him, played his part perfectly. "Of course, Penelope. I'll have Maureen prepare the documents for review. We'll set aside the full afternoon to make sure everyone's comfortable with the arrangements." "Wonderful. And Arthur?" "I want to make sure we have proper notarization available. I don't want any technical issues to delay the process." "Naturally. I'll have Janice Mallon standing by. We'll take care of everything." After I hung up, Grant was practically vibrating with excitement, though he was trying to maintain his facade of concerned son. "That's really thoughtful of you to include us in the process, Mom," he said. "I want you to know we don't take this responsibility lightly." "I know you don't," I replied, looking directly at him in the mirror. "I'm counting on you to take it very seriously indeed." That evening, while Grant and Sloane went home to presumably celebrate their impending windfall, I worked with Arthur and his partner Maureen Klein to prepare the most elaborate legal deception of my career. The centerpiece was a thick binder labeled Final Estate Plan Penelope Ashford, filled with documents that looked official and comprehensive but were actually carefully crafted decoys. There were unsigned drafts of new wills, sample power of attorney forms with missing notarization, and a particularly impressive authorization letter that appeared to grant immediate access to my accounts, but was legally meaningless due to improper witness requirements and incorrect statute citations. "The beauty of this approach," Maureen explained as she reviewed the decoy documents, "is that everything looks legitimate to a layperson, but no court would ever enforce these papers. They're too flawed, too incomplete, and when Grant tries to use them, he'll discover that banking protocols, insurance company procedures, and legal requirements aren't suggestions. They're absolute barriers that can't be bypassed with impressive-looking paperwork." Arthur's office had been equipped with discreet surveillance cameras and high-quality audio recording equipment, all properly posted and disclosed to meet legal admissibility standards. Everything Grant and Sloane said or did during our meeting would be documented with courtroom-quality precision. "Are you sure you want to take this all the way?" Arthur asked as we finished our preparations. "Once Grant attempts to use fraudulent documents, we'll have no choice but to involve law enforcement." I thought about the moment in my breakfast room when Grant had threatened to let me die unless I made him my sole beneficiary. I thought about the cold calculation in his eyes, the casual cruelty of using my medical emergency as leverage. "Arthur," I said quietly, "some betrayals are so complete that forgiveness becomes complicity. Grant stopped being my son the moment he decided my death would be profitable. What happens to him now is simply justice. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Sloane, sent from her own phone rather than Grant's. "Thank you so much for including us tomorrow. We won't let you down." I stared at that message for a long moment, remembering the young woman who had charmed her way into our family with talk of children and tradition and carrying on the Ashford legacy. Now she was texting me thank you notes for the opportunity to steal my fortune. I typed back, "I'm sure you'll give me exactly what I deserve." If only she knew how prophetic those words would prove to be. Tomorrow, Grant and Sloane would walk into Arthur's office expecting to gain control of millions of dollars. Instead, they would begin the process of destroying themselves with their own greed, their own words, and their own criminal actions. I fell asleep that night with the deep satisfaction of someone who knows that justice is not just coming, it's inevitable. Arthur's law firm occupied the top 3 floors of the Meridian building downtown, its walnut-paneled conference rooms and floor-to-ceiling windows projecting exactly the kind of old-money discretion that clients like me valued. I arrived at 2:00 p.m. sharp, wearing my most conservative black suit and the pearl necklace that had been Thomas's final gift to me before his death. Grant and Sloane were already in the reception area, both looking like actors preparing for the performance of their lives. Grant wore his most expensive suit, the Italian one I'd helped him buy for his wedding, while Sloane had chosen a cream-colored ensemble that suggested respectful daughter-in-law without being ostentatious about it. They thought they were here to steal my fortune. They had no idea they were about to document their own crimes in high definition. Arthur greeted us in his trademark style, warm but professional, putting everyone at ease while maintaining absolute control over the process. He escorted us to Conference Room A, the largest of his meeting spaces, where the mahogany table was arranged with legal pads, pens, and bottles of San Pellegrino water. "Before we begin," Arthur announced, "I want everyone to understand that today is a review session only. We're here to discuss the proposed changes to Penelope's estate plan and ensure everyone understands the implications. No documents will be executed today." Maureen Klein was already seated at the far end of the table, her laptop open and a stack of files neatly arranged beside her. She nodded politely to Grant and Sloane but didn't engage in small talk. Maureen was all business, all the time. "I've also asked Janice Mallon to join us," Arthur continued, gesturing to a woman in her 50s who sat quietly near the windows. "Janice is our preferred notary public, and while we won't be notarizing anything today, I wanted her to observe the proceedings so she can ensure proper execution when we do the final signing." Janice smiled pleasantly and made a note in her own legal pad. What Grant and Sloane didn't know was that Janice was also a retired paralegal with 30 years of experience spotting fraudulent documents and questionable legal procedures. Arthur began by presenting the decoy binder, opening it with theatrical precision to reveal the impressive-looking but legally worthless documents we'd prepared. "This represents a comprehensive restructuring of Penelope's estate plan," he explained, turning pages slowly so Grant and Sloane could see the scope of the materials. "The new will streamlines beneficiary designations. The revised power of attorney grants broader authority for financial management, and the accompanying authorization letters provide immediate access to accounts and investments." Grant's eyes were locked on the documents, like a hawk watching prey. I could see him cataloging the account numbers, the asset descriptions, the authorization language that he thought would give him control over my entire fortune. "This looks very thorough," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "When would the final execution take place?" "That depends on several factors," Maureen interjected smoothly. "These are draft documents that require careful review and proper notarization. Janice, could you explain the requirements for valid execution?" Janice cleared her throat and spoke with the calm authority of someone who'd seen every possible variation of legal document preparation. For documents of this scope and financial impact, we need in-person identification verification, witness signatures, and proper notarial seals, she explained. The authorization letters, in particular, require specific statutory language and attestation procedures. What I'm seeing here are drafts that would need significant revision before notarization could occur. Grant's smile faltered slightly. What kind of revisions? Witness requirements, proper state code citations, compliance with banking regulations. Janice rattled off with professional efficiency. These drafts are a good starting point, but they're not ready for execution. I watched Grant process this information, seeing the calculation behind his eyes. He'd expected to walk out of this meeting with signed documents, giving him immediate access to my accounts. Instead, he was learning that the legal system had safeguards designed to prevent exactly what he was trying to accomplish. Well, I said with carefully feigned frailty, I suppose we'll need to schedule another meeting once everything is properly prepared. In the meantime, perhaps Grant and Sloan could take the binder home to review? I want them to be completely comfortable with all the arrangements. Arthur nodded approvingly. That's an excellent idea. Take your time reviewing everything, ask questions, make notes. We want this process to be thorough and transparent. Grant accepted the binder with barely concealed eagerness, slipping it into his briefcase as if it contained actual treasure rather than an elaborate legal trap. Thank you, Mother, he said, leaning over to kiss my cheek with performance-perfect affection. This means everything to us. I know it does, I replied, meeting his eyes with the kind of loving maternal gaze that concealed a heart full of ice. As we gathered our things to leave, Arthur casually mentioned one more detail that would prove crucial to Grant's eventual destruction. Oh, Penelope, I should mention that we've implemented additional security protocols at the private bank. Trent Albright has instituted callback verification procedures for any large transactions or account modifications. It's standard practice for clients of your profile. Grant's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Callback procedures? Out-of-band voice verification, Maureen explained. If anyone tries to access or modify accounts using power of attorney documents, the bank calls the account holder directly to confirm authorization. It prevents fraud and elder abuse. Very sensible, Sloan said, though her voice sounded slightly strained. As we walked toward the elevator, Grant and Sloan exchanged a look that I pretended not to notice. They were realizing that stealing my fortune would be more complicated than simply forging my signature on impressive-looking documents. In the elevator, Grant made his first real mistake. Don't worry about those callback procedures, Mom, he said, his voice taking on a slightly menacing undertone. We'll make sure everything goes smoothly when the time comes. The elevator's security camera captured every word, and the threatening implication was unmistakable. Grant was already planning to circumvent the banking safeguards, probably by controlling my access to phones or intimidating me into compliance. As the elevator doors opened in the parking garage, Sloan finally revealed her true feelings about the day's events. We'll handle it tonight, she whispered to Grant, apparently believing the parking garage was private enough for honest conversation. They had no idea that Arthur's building security system included audio surveillance in all common areas. Grant and Sloan drove away with their briefcase full of worthless documents, convinced they were one step away from claiming my fortune. I watched their car disappear into traffic and felt the deep satisfaction of a chess player who has just moved her opponent exactly where she wants them. Phase 1 complete, Arthur said quietly as we stood beside my car. How long before they make their move? I asked. Based on their behavior today, I'd say 48 hours. Grant's too impatient to wait longer than that, and they're clearly planning something for tonight. I smiled as I got into my car, already anticipating the phone call that would come tomorrow when Grant tried to use his fraudulent documents to access my accounts. He was about to discover that the difference between looking wealthy on paper and actually controlling wealth was a chasm that would swallow him completely. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait for him to spring it. I didn't have to wait long. At 11:47 p.m. that same evening, my phone rang with a call from Trent Albright's emergency line at the private bank. I was expecting it, but I still felt a thrill of satisfaction when I heard his voice. "Mrs. Ashford, I apologize for calling so late, but we have a situation that requires your immediate attention," Trent said, his tone professional but tense. "We've received an electronic submission requesting immediate wire transfer authorization and account access changes." "What kind of submission?" I asked, though I already knew. "Someone has emailed us scanned copies of what appear to be power of attorney documents and account authorization letters, along with a request for a $480,000 wire transfer to something called Meridian Holdings, LLC. The submission came from an email address registered to your son, Grant Ashford." I sat up in bed, reaching for the legal pad where I'd been tracking Grant's moves. "And what was your response?" "We implemented standard fraud prevention protocols immediately," Trent explained. "Out-of-band verification calls to you, escalation to our financial crimes department, and preliminary documentation for a suspicious activity report." The beauty of the private banking world is that institutions like Trent's Bank had seen every possible variation of financial elder abuse. They had protocols specifically designed to catch exactly what Grant was attempting. "The documents themselves are problematic," Trent continued. "They lack proper notarization, the witness signatures are missing, and the statutory references are incorrect. Our legal department flagged them as likely fraudulent within 20 minutes of receipt." "What happens now?" "We've denied the transfer request and frozen any account modifications pending investigation. Grant has already called twice demanding to speak with senior management about what he calls unnecessary delays. He seems quite agitated." I could imagine. Grant had probably spent the evening celebrating his anticipated windfall, perhaps even making plans for how to spend the money he thought he was about to steal. "There's more," Trent said. "He's also submitted beneficiary change requests to your life insurance companies using the same fraudulent documents. The insurers have contacted us as part of their verification process." This was even better than I'd hoped. Grant wasn't just attempting to steal my liquid assets. He was trying to position himself to profit from my death as quickly as possible. "I assume the insurance companies have their own fraud prevention measures?" "Absolutely. They've already flagged the requests as potentially coercive and have initiated their own investigation. Any attempts to change beneficiaries are frozen pending resolution of the elder abuse inquiry." After I hung up with Trent, I called Arthur to update him on Grant's moves. He was awake despite the late hour, having anticipated that Grant would act quickly once he had the decoy documents. "He's moving faster than I expected," Arthur observed. "And he's being more aggressive about it. The wire transfer request and insurance changes show clear intent to commit fraud. Is it enough for criminal charges? Combined with the threat recording from your breakfast room and his intimidation in the elevator?" "Absolutely. I'll contact Detective Neil Spader in the morning. He heads the Financial Crimes Unit and specializes in elder abuse cases." I lay awake for a while after that, thinking about the little boy who used to help me bake cookies for his school fundraisers. Grant had been such a sweet child, always eager to please, always proud when he could help with grown-up tasks. When had that boy been replaced by the man who was now frantically trying to steal his mother's fortune? The next morning brought a flurry of activity. Grant appeared at the private bank's branch office at 9 a.m. sharp, briefcase in hand, demanding to speak with senior management about the unnecessary delays in processing his mother's clearly expressed wishes. The branch manager, who had been briefed on the situation, politely explained that additional verification was required for transactions of this scope and that the bank's legal department had concerns about the documentation. Grant's response was captured on the bank's security cameras. "My mother isn't well. She's confused and frightened, and she needs me to handle these matters. These callback procedures are just going to upset her." The attempt to portray me as mentally incompetent while simultaneously trying to steal my money was so audacious that even the bank manager seemed taken aback. "Sir," the manager replied carefully, "our protocols are designed to protect our clients, regardless of their family relationships. We'll need to speak directly with Mrs. Ashford before processing any significant transactions." Grant's frustration was palpable, but he maintained his facade of concerned son. "Of course. I understand you're just doing your job. But please understand that my mother is fragile right now, and these bureaucratic delays are causing her significant stress." What Grant didn't realize was that Detective Neil Spader was already building a case file based on Arthur's preliminary report. Every attempt Grant made to bypass banking security, every claim about my mental state, every pressure tactic he employed was being documented as evidence of elder abuse and financial exploitation. That afternoon, I received a call from Grant that confirmed everything Arthur and I had suspected about his true character. "Mother, there seems to be some confusion at the bank," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "They're claiming there are problems with the documents Arthur prepared. I think someone is trying to interfere with your wishes." "What kind of problems?" I asked innocently. "Technical issues with notarization, witness signatures, that sort of bureaucratic nonsense." I told them you're not well enough to deal with these delays, but they're insisting on speaking with you directly. The manipulation was breathtaking. Grant was trying to convince me that my own bank's fraud prevention measures were somehow an attack on my autonomy, while positioning himself as my protector against institutional interference. "Perhaps I should call Trent myself," I suggested.
No.
Grant's response was immediate and sharp. "I mean, there's no need to stress yourself with these details. I can handle everything. That's why we set up the power of attorney, remember? Except, of course, that we hadn't set up any such thing. The documents Grant was trying to use were worthless forgeries that wouldn't fool a first-year law student, let alone a sophisticated financial institution." "Grant," I said carefully, "I'm feeling a bit confused about all this. Maybe we should meet with Arthur again to make sure I understand what I signed." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for several heartbeats. When Grant spoke again, his voice carried a threatening undertone that chilled me to the bone. "Mother, I think you're letting anxiety cloud your judgment. We've already taken care of everything. The best thing you can do now is rest and let me handle the financial details. That's what loving sons do. And if I don't want to rest? If I want to be involved in managing my own affairs?" Another pause. Then Grant's voice, cold and calculating. "I don't think that would be wise. You're not thinking clearly right now. Sometimes families have to make difficult decisions to protect the people they love." The implicit threat was unmistakable. Grant was telling me, in language carefully chosen to avoid explicit criminality, that he would override my wishes whether I cooperated or not. I ended the call and immediately contacted Arthur, who had been expecting my update. "He's accelerating the timeline," Arthur observed after I described the conversation. "The banking rejections have made him desperate, and desperate people make mistakes." "What's our next move?" "We let him make those mistakes while we document everything. Detective Spader is ready to move whenever we give him the signal. All we need is one more clear attempt at fraud, and we'll have enough evidence to arrest him." That evening, I sent Grant a text message designed to give him exactly the opening he needed to destroy himself. "I'm feeling overwhelmed by all the financial complexity. Maybe you're right that I should let you handle everything. Can we meet tomorrow to simplify the arrangements?" Grant's response came within minutes. "Perfect. I'll bring the necessary paperwork. We can take care of everything at your house where you'll be comfortable." The trap was set for the final act. Tomorrow, Grant would come to my home expecting to force me to sign documents that would give him control of my fortune. Instead, he would find himself facing Detective Spader and a comprehensive criminal investigation that would destroy his life as thoroughly as he had planned to destroy mine. I spent that evening reviewing the evidence Arthur and I had compiled. The breakfast room recording of Grant's original threat, the elevator surveillance showing his intimidation tactics, the banking records of his fraudulent attempts, and the insurance company documentation of his efforts to profit from my eventual death. It was a masterpiece of legal preparation, a case so airtight that no defense attorney in the world could create reasonable doubt about Grant's guilt. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Grant earlier. His willingness to threaten me, to override my autonomy, to steal my life's work. It revealed a depth of selfishness and cruelty that no mother should ever have to confront in her own child. But confronting it I was, and tomorrow would bring the reckoning that Grant had earned through his own choices. He wanted to simplify our arrangements? Fine. I would make them very simple indeed. The morning of Grant's final downfall dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that seemed to match the somber nature of what was about to unfold. I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit with my pearl jewelry, wanting to look dignified and competent for what would likely be recorded encounters. Arthur arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, accompanied by ADA Rebecca Voss, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s who specialized in financial crimes and elder abuse. I had met Rebecca twice before during the preparation phase, and I was impressed by her thoroughness and her genuine anger at the crimes Grant had attempted. "Mrs. Ashford," Rebecca said as she set up recording equipment in my living room, "I want you to understand that we have more than enough evidence to arrest your son right now. What we're doing today is giving him the opportunity to compound his crimes and eliminate any possible defense strategy his attorney might attempt." Detective Neil Spader was positioned in an unmarked vehicle outside my estate, with backup units standing by. Adult Protective Services had been notified and were prepared to intervene if Grant became threatening or violent. "Remember," Arthur instructed me, "let him talk. Let him explain his plans, his justifications, his methods. The more he says, the stronger our case becomes." At 11 a.m., Grant arrived with Sloan and an unexpected third party. A young woman carrying a portable notary kit who introduced herself as someone they'd found through an online service. "I brought Linda to handle the notarization," Grant explained as they settled into my living room. "This way we can take care of everything today without any more delays." Linda unpacked her supplies with professional efficiency, but when she began reviewing the documents Grant handed her, her expression grew increasingly concerned. "I'm sorry," she said after several minutes, "but I can't notarize these documents. They're missing required witness signatures. The statutory citations are incorrect, and some of the pages appear to be drafts rather than final documents." Grant's face flushed with anger. "What are you talking about?" "These are official legal documents prepared by my mother's attorney." "Sir, I'm a certified notary public with 12 years of experience. These documents don't meet basic legal standards for notarization. I could lose my license if I put my seal on papers this flawed." Linda packed up her supplies and left, apologizing for the wasted trip, but unwilling to risk her professional credentials on Grant's fraudulent papers. After she was gone, Grant's mask finally slipped completely. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, pacing around my living room with barely controlled fury. "Mother, these banking delays and notary games are just bureaucratic obstacles. You own this money. You should be able to access it however you want." "Perhaps we should call Arthur to clarify the procedures," I suggested mildly. "No more lawyers," Grant exploded. "No more procedures. No more delays. You're going to sign these documents right now, and I'm going to take them to the bank myself." Sloan, who had been silent up to this point, finally revealed her true nature. "Just copy her signature," she hissed to Grant. "No one's going to check the paperwork that closely. Once we have access to the accounts, we can fix any technical problems later." Grant stared at her for a moment, then at the worthless documents spread across my coffee table. I could see him weighing his options, calculating risks, deciding whether to cross the final line into outright forgery. He made his choice. Pulling out a pen, Grant began carefully copying my signature from a sample document, working on one of the authorization letters that he believed would give him access to my accounts. "There," he said with satisfaction, forging my name with practiced precision. "That should satisfy the bank's requirements." The recording equipment captured every moment of the forgery, along with Sloane's encouragement and Grant's clear statement of intent to defraud financial institutions. "Grant," I said quietly, "what you just did is a felony." He looked up at me with cold indifference. "What I just did is take care of business. You're too old and too confused to manage these affairs yourself. Someone has to be the adult in this family. And if I refuse to cooperate with your plans?" Grant leaned forward, his voice dropping to the same threatening whisper he'd used in my breakfast room weeks earlier. "Then you'll find out what happens to elderly people who can't take care of themselves. Nursing homes, conservatorship, competency hearings, there are lots of ways to protect someone who's lost the ability to make rational decisions." The threat was explicit and devastating. Grant was telling me that if I didn't willingly hand over my fortune, he would use the legal system to have me declared incompetent and take it anyway. Sloane nodded approvingly. "We're not trying to hurt you, Mother Ashford. We're trying to protect you from making mistakes that could affect your security." "What kind of mistakes?" "Trusting the wrong people," Grant said meaningfully. "Lawyers who charge excessive fees, bankers who create unnecessary complications, anyone who benefits from keeping you dependent on their services." The irony was breathtaking. Grant was positioning himself as my protector while simultaneously stealing my life's work and threatening to have me institutionalized if I resisted. I excused myself to use the bathroom, and while there, sent a single text message to Arthur. Enough. Within 5 minutes, Detective Spader was knocking on my front door. "Good morning, Mrs. Ashford," he said politely when I answered. "I'm Detective Spader with the Financial Crimes Unit. We've received reports of potential elder abuse and financial exploitation. May I come in?" Grant and Sloane went white when they saw the detective's badge. Grant immediately began his concerned son performance, but it was too late. We had everything we needed on tape. "Detective, I'm Grant Ashford, Mrs. Ashford's son," Grant said, standing and extending his hand. "I'm not sure what reports you've received, but I can assure you that my mother is being well cared for." "I'm sure she is," Detective Spader replied neutrally. "But we've had reports of attempted financial fraud, forged documents, and coercive behavior. I'd like to ask you a few questions about some banking transactions that were flagged by our fraud department." Grant's composure began to crack. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've been helping my mother with some estate planning, but everything has been completely legitimate." "Including the forged signatures?" "What forged signatures?" Detective Spader gestured to the coffee table where Grant's freshly forged authorization letter lay in plain sight. "The signature you just applied to that document, for instance." Grant looked down at the evidence of his crime, then back at the detective, then at me sitting calmly in my chair watching his world collapse. "You set me up," he whispered, finally understanding that he'd been playing a game where I controlled all the pieces. "No, Grant," I replied quietly. "I simply gave you enough rope to hang yourself. You chose to tie the knot." Detective Spader placed Grant under arrest for felony extortion, attempted grand larceny, forgery, and elder abuse endangerment. The search warrant for his home would yield additional evidence of fraud planning and conspiracy. As they led my son away in handcuffs, Grant turned to look at me one final time. "I'm still your son," he said desperately. "I'm still family." I met his eyes with the cold indifference he had shown me when I was dying in my breakfast room. "Family doesn't threaten to let their mothers die for money," I replied. "You stopped being my son the moment you made that choice." The door closed behind them, and for the first time in weeks, my house was quiet. Arthur, Rebecca, and Detective Spader spent the next hour reviewing the evidence and planning the prosecution strategy. Grant's crimes were so well documented that his conviction was virtually certain. What about Sloan?
I asked.
Accessory charges for encouraging the forgery and participating in the conspiracy, Rebecca explained. Not as serious as Grant's charges, but enough to ensure she faces consequences for her role. As the law enforcement officials packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, I felt a profound sense of completion. Grant had been caught, prosecuted, and removed from my life with surgical precision. There would be no reconciliation, no forgiveness, no second chances. He had chosen greed over family, and now he would live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of his life. Justice, I reflected, was sometimes a dish best served methodically. While Detective Spader and ADA Rebecca Voss built their criminal case against Grant, Arthur and I launched a comprehensive civil assault designed to ensure that my son would never again be in a position to threaten me or my assets. The next morning, Arthur filed a battery of legal documents that would systematically dismantle Grant's life piece by piece. His approach was methodical, thorough, and absolutely devastating. First came the petition for a temporary restraining order based on financial exploitation and elder abuse. The evidence was overwhelming. We had Grant's original threat on video, recordings of his intimidation tactics, documented attempts to bypass banking security, and clear evidence of forgery. Judge Patrick Reeve granted the TRO within hours of filing. This order, Arthur explained to me as we reviewed the paperwork, prohibits Grant from having any contact with you outside the presence of attorneys. He cannot call, text, email, or approach your property. He also cannot attempt any transactions involving your accounts or assets. Second was a comprehensive civil complaint alleging conversion, attempted conversion, fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violations of the state's elder abuse statutes. The damages we sought were both monetary and injunctive, financial compensation for my legal fees and emotional distress, plus permanent orders protecting my estate from future interference. The beauty of civil proceedings, Maureen Klein observed, is that the burden of proof is lower than in criminal court. We don't need to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, just that it's more likely than not that Grant committed these acts. Third, and most importantly, Arthur filed an emergency petition asking the court to affirm the validity of my existing estate plan and the absolute nature of the no contest clause. If Grant had any remaining hope of inheriting from my estate, this filing would eliminate it permanently. The process server found Grant at his home on Thursday afternoon, delivering the legal papers while news vans lined his street. The criminal charges had already made local headlines: local attorney arrested for attempting to defraud elderly mother, and the civil filings added another layer of public humiliation. Grant's initial reaction was to laugh off the civil suit, apparently believing that family relationships would somehow protect him from serious legal consequences. His confidence lasted exactly as long as it took his attorney to review the evidence we'd compiled. According to sources at Grant's law firm, he was placed on immediate administrative leave pending resolution of the criminal charges. The State Bar Association had also opened its own investigation into his conduct, with license suspension or revocation being distinct possibilities. Judge Reeves scheduled a hearing on our injunctive relief motions for the following Tuesday. Grant's attorney requested a continuance, claiming they needed more time to review the extensive evidence we'd submitted. Judge Reeve denied the request. The allegations involve ongoing financial exploitation of an elderly victim, the judge noted in his order. Any delay in granting appropriate relief could result in additional harm to the plaintiff. The hearing itself was a masterpiece of legal precision. Arthur presented our case methodically, starting with the breakfast room recording of Grant's original threat and building to the banking fraud attempts and the witnessed forgery. Grant's attorney, David Walsh, attempted to portray the entire situation as a family misunderstanding complicated by my natural anxiety about aging and estate planning. He argued that Grant's actions, while perhaps misguided, were motivated by genuine concern for my welfare. Arthur demolished this defense in minutes. "Your Honor," he said, playing the audio recording of Grant threatening to let me die, "this is not the voice of a concerned son. This is the voice of an extortionist who held his mother's life hostage to steal her fortune." Judge Reeve listened to the entire recording with an expression of growing disgust. When it ended, he looked directly at Grant with the kind of judicial displeasure that defense attorneys fear most. "Mr. Grant Ashford," Judge Reeve said, "I have presided over family law cases for 23 years, and I have never heard anything quite as disturbing as your voice on that recording. The idea that you would threaten to withhold emergency medical care from your own mother unless she rewrote her will in your favor represents a level of callousness that is difficult to comprehend." Grant tried to respond, but Judge Reeve cut him off with a raised hand. "The court grants all injunctive relief requested by the plaintiff. Mr. Grant Ashford is permanently enjoined from any contact with his mother outside the presence of counsel. He is barred from any attempt to access, modify, or influence Mrs. Penelope Ashford's financial accounts, insurance policies, or estate planning documents. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and criminal contempt charges." Judge Reeve also granted our request for an expedited hearing on the validity of my estate plan and the enforcement of the no contest clause. It is clear to this court that any attempt by Mr. Grant Ashford to challenge his mother's estate plan would constitute a direct violation of the no contest provisions, Judge Reeve continued. Such a challenge would result in his immediate and permanent disinheritance. As Grant was led from the courtroom by his attorney, he turned to look at me one last time. I met his gaze with calm indifference, showing no emotion as I watched his life crumble around him. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd of reporters was waiting for statements. Arthur had prepared me for this moment, and I delivered my comments with the precision of someone who had spent weeks planning every word. "Justice has been served today," I told the assembled media. "My son chose greed over family, money over morality. The court has ensured that choice has consequences." "Do you have any regrets about prosecuting your own son?" one reporter asked. "I regret that I raised a son capable of threatening his mother's life for money," I replied. "But I have no regrets about ensuring he faces the full consequences of his actions." That evening, Arthur and I celebrated with a quiet dinner at my favorite restaurant. The civil case was essentially over. Grant's assets would be frozen pending resolution of the damages phase, and his legal fees would consume whatever remained of his resources. "He'll be financially ruined even before the criminal trial begins," Arthur observed over our main course. "Legal fees, civil damages, lost income from his suspended law practice. He'll have nothing left." "Good," I said, surprising myself with the coldness in my voice. He wanted my money badly enough to threaten my life for it. It's only fitting that his greed should cost him everything he already had. By the time our dessert arrived, Arthur had received a text message that brought the perfect end to a perfect day. "Sloane has filed for divorce," he announced with satisfaction. Apparently she's claiming that Grant hid his criminal activities from her and that she was an unwitting participant in his schemes. I smiled at the poetic justice of it all. Grant had lost his freedom, his career, his fortune, and now his marriage, all because he'd been unable to wait for his inheritance like a normal person. Some lessons, I reflected, could only be learned the hard way. And Grant was about to get a masterclass in consequences. The arrest that would cement Grant's destruction came exactly 1 week after Judge Reeve's civil ruling. Despite the restraining order, despite the criminal charges already pending, despite the clear evidence that his schemes had been exposed, Grant made one final desperate attempt to access my fortune. Detective Spader had been monitoring Grant's movements as part of the ongoing investigation, and when my son appeared at Meridian Private Bank on Tuesday morning carrying the forged documents and demanding access to my safe deposit box, the detective was ready. I watched from across the street, sitting in my car with Arthur, as Grant walked confidently into the bank that would become the scene of his final humiliation. He carried himself with the same arrogant swagger he displayed throughout this ordeal, apparently convinced that his legal troubles were just temporary setbacks that wouldn't prevent him from ultimately claiming what he believed was his. Inside the bank, Trent Albright was waiting with Detective Spader and two uniformed officers. The entire encounter was recorded by the bank's high-definition security system, creating a permanent record of Grant's final criminal act. "Mr. Ashford," Trent greeted Grant politely when he approached the customer service desk. "How can I help you today?" Grant placed his briefcase on the counter and opened it with theatrical precision, removing the folder of forged documents he'd prepared. "I need access to my mother's safe deposit box and authorization for a cashier's check in the amount of $750,000, he announced, apparently believing that confidence and volume would overcome the bank's security protocols. Trent examined the documents with professional care, though he already knew they were fraudulent. "I see you have what appears to be a power of attorney. However, our records show that Mrs. Ashford has specifically flagged her accounts for additional verification procedures." Grant's jaw tightened with frustration. "My mother is elderly and confused. She doesn't understand these banking complications. These documents give me full authority to manage her affairs." "I understand your position, sir, but our compliance department requires direct contact with the account holder for transactions of this magnitude. It's bank policy." "My mother is too ill for these kinds of stressful conversations," Grant snapped, his voice rising with anger. "She's had a recent cardiac episode and can't be subjected to bureaucratic harassment." That's when Detective Spader stepped out from the private office, where he'd been observing the encounter. "Mr. Ashford," the detective said, showing his badge, "I'm Detective Spader with the Financial Crimes Unit. I have some questions about these documents you're trying to use." Grant's face went white as he recognized the detective who had arrested him at my house. These are legitimate legal documents. My mother authorized me to handle her financial affairs." "Including the signature you forged last week?" Grant stared at the detective, then at Trent, then at the security cameras he was just now noticing positioned throughout the bank. The reality of his situation was finally beginning to penetrate his delusions of success. "These documents," Detective Spader continued, "contain forged signatures, false notarizations, and fraudulent authorizations. Using them to attempt to access another person's assets constitutes multiple felonies." "You don't understand," Grant said desperately. "My mother wants me to have access to these accounts. She's just too confused right now to deal with the paperwork herself. Mr. Ashford, your mother is currently sitting across the street in her attorney's car, watching this conversation through the window. She appears quite lucid and very interested in the outcome of your visit here today." Grant spun around to look out the bank's floor-to-ceiling windows, and I saw the exact moment when he spotted my car parked across the street. His expression shifted from desperation to rage, to complete defeat as he realized that I had orchestrated this final trap with the same precision I'd used for everything else. "You're under arrest," Detective Spader announced, producing handcuffs, "for attempted grand larceny, forgery, elder abuse, and violation of a restraining order." As Grant was handcuffed for the second time in 2 weeks, he kept staring at me through the bank window. I met his gaze steadily, showing no emotion as I watched my son's final downfall. The search warrant executed at Grant's home that afternoon yielded a treasure trove of additional evidence. Investigators found detailed financial projections showing how he planned to spend my money, notes about my daily routines and vulnerabilities, and even research into nursing homes and conservatorship procedures. Most damning was a digital memo found on Sloan's laptop titled Asset Recovery Timeline, which detailed their month-by-month plan for gaining control of my fortune and outlined contingency strategies if I proved resistant to their management. They had this planned for at least 6 months, Rebecca Voss explained to me during a meeting the next day. The cardiac episode just accelerated their timeline, but they were always planning to find a way to take control of your assets. The evidence was so comprehensive that Grant's attorney immediately began exploring plea deal options. However, Rebecca was in no mood for leniency. "Your son threatened to let you die unless you made him your sole beneficiary," she told me. "He forged legal documents, attempted to defraud multiple financial institutions, and violated a restraining order. We're going to trial, and we're going to ask for the maximum sentence on every charge." Grant's arrest made national news this time, picked up by cable networks and true crime podcasts as an example of elder abuse within wealthy families. The story had everything: family betrayal, attempted murder for money, and a clever elderly woman who outsmarted her would-be exploiter. I declined most interview requests, preferring to let the legal process speak for itself. But I did agree to one interview with a local newspaper, partly to set the record straight and partly to ensure that Grant's humiliation was as complete as possible. "Mrs. Ashford," the reporter asked, "do you feel any sadness about what's happened to your son?" "I feel sadness for the little boy I raised, who would have been horrified by the man he became," I replied. "But I feel no sadness for the criminal who threatened to let his mother die for money. That person deserves everything that's happening to him." As I watched the news coverage that evening, showing Grant being led away in handcuffs while reporters detailed his crimes, I reflected on how completely the tables had turned. 6 weeks ago, Grant had stood over me in my breakfast room, holding my life hostage while demanding control of my fortune. Tonight, he was sitting in a jail cell, facing decades in prison, financially ruined and permanently cut off from the family he had betrayed. Sometimes justice wasn't just served cold, it was served with surgical precision. Grant's trial began on a bitter February morning, with snow falling on the courthouse steps and a wind that cut through even the heaviest coats. I arrived precisely at 8:30 a.m., wearing my most formal black suit and the pearl jewelry that had become my signature during this ordeal. The media attention was intense but respectful. The story of an elderly woman outsmarting her greedy son had captured the public imagination, and I'd become something of a folk hero for seniors facing financial exploitation. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense with anticipation. ADA Rebecca Voss had assembled a prosecution team that was methodical, thorough, and absolutely determined to see Grant receive the maximum possible sentence for his crimes. Grant's defense attorney, David Walsh, had spent months trying to negotiate a plea deal, but Rebecca had rejected every offer. She wanted this case to go to trial, to send a clear message that elder abuse would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Judge Patrick Reeve presided with his usual stern efficiency, making it clear from the outset that he would tolerate no drama or delays in his courtroom. The jury selection had taken 3 days, resulting in a panel that skewed older and more conservative, exactly the demographic most likely to be outraged by Grant's crimes. Several jurors were elderly parents themselves, and I could see the disgust in their faces when the charges were read aloud. Rebecca's opening statement was a masterpiece of prosecutorial precision. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this case is about the ultimate betrayal. A son who threatened to let his own mother die unless she rewrote her will to make him the sole beneficiary of her fortune." She outlined the evidence systematically. The breakfast room recording of Grant's original threat, the banking fraud attempts, the forged documents, and the violation of the restraining order that led to his final arrest. "You will hear the defendant's own voice threatening his mother's life," Rebecca continued. "You will see him forge her signature on legal documents. You will hear him plan to have her declared incompetent if she refused to cooperate with his schemes. This is not a family dispute. This is a crime spree targeting an elderly victim by someone who is supposed to protect her. David Walsh's opening statement attempted to portray Grant as a concerned son whose good intentions had been misunderstood and manipulated by a vindictive mother and overzealous prosecutors. Grant Ashford is not a criminal, Walsh argued. He's a successful attorney who became concerned about his mother's financial management and took steps he believed were in her best interests. Yes, he made mistakes in his approach, but criminal intent requires more than poor judgment or family miscommunication. The defense strategy was clear. Blame me for orchestrating the entire situation while portraying Grant as a victim of my manipulation. It was a dangerous approach that risked alienating the jury, but Walsh apparently had few other options given the overwhelming evidence of Grant's guilt. The prosecution's case unfolded over 6 days, each piece of evidence more damning than the last. The EMT who had responded to my cardiac episode testified that Grant had indeed delayed calling for help, corroborating my claims about his behavior during the medical emergency. Trent Albright detailed the bank's fraud prevention protocols and Grant's repeated attempts to bypass security measures designed to protect elderly customers from financial exploitation. Janice Mallon, the notary public, testified about her refusal to notarize Grant's clearly fraudulent documents and explained the legal requirements he had failed to meet. Detective Spader walked the jury through the investigation, showing how each of Grant's crimes built upon the previous ones in an escalating pattern of financial exploitation. But the most powerful moment came when Rebecca played the breakfast room recording in its entirety. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Grant's voice filled the space. "Make me the sole beneficiary of your fortune, or I'll let you die right here." Several jurors looked visibly disturbed, and one elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The impact was devastating and undeniable. When I took the witness stand on the 4th day, I was ready. I had prepared for this moment for months, knowing that my testimony would either vindicate my actions or make me appear like a vindictive old woman seeking revenge against her own son. "Mrs. Ashford," Rebecca began, "can you describe your relationship with your son before these events?" "Grant was everything to me after his father died," I said honestly. "I supported him through law school, helped him start his practice, welcomed his wife into our family. I thought we had a loving relationship built on mutual respect and genuine affection." "When did you first realize that your son viewed you differently?" "When he threatened to let me die unless I made him my sole beneficiary. In that moment, I understood that he saw me not as his mother, but as an obstacle to his financial security." Rebecca guided me through the entire timeline, from Grant's original threat to his final arrest at the bank. I answered every question clearly and directly, maintaining my composure even when describing the most painful moments of his betrayal. The cross-examination was brutal, but expected. David Walsh tried to paint me as a controlling mother who had manipulated the entire situation to punish Grant for his independence. "Mrs. Ashford, isn't it true that you've always used financial control to manipulate your son's behavior?" "Mr. Walsh, if I were controlling, would my son have felt the need to threaten my life to gain access to my money? Wouldn't a truly controlling mother have simply cut him off financially? Isn't it true that you deliberately created this situation to entrap your son?" "I created a situation that allowed my son to reveal his true character. He chose to threaten my life, forge my signature, and attempt to steal my fortune. Those were his choices, not mine." Walsh tried for 3 hours to crack my testimony, but every attack only reinforced the strength of our case. By the time I stepped down from the witness stand, it was clear that the jury believed my version of events completely. The defense's case was weak and desperate. Walsh called character witnesses who testified to Grant's previous good reputation, but their testimonials rang hollow against the audio recordings of his crimes. Grant's law school professors spoke about his intelligence and potential, his colleagues described his professional competence, and his former clients praised his legal skills. But none of this could overcome the fact that the jury had heard him threaten to let his mother die for money. Walsh made the critical error of putting Grant on the stand in his own defense. Grant maintained his innocence, of course, claiming that his words in the breakfast room had been misunderstood and that his subsequent actions were motivated by genuine concern for my welfare. "I never intended to hurt my mother," he testified. "I was trying to help her manage her affairs during a difficult time. If my approach was wrong, I'm sorry, but I never meant any harm." Rebecca's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. "Mr. Ashford, when your mother collapsed in her breakfast room, how long did you wait before calling for help?" I don't remember exactly." "You don't remember? Your mother was having a cardiac episode, and you don't remember how long you waited before seeking medical assistance." "I was trying to assess the situation. By threatening to let her die unless she changed her will?" Grant's composure cracked completely. He started to explain, then stopped, then tried again, his answers becoming increasingly incoherent as Rebecca methodically destroyed his credibility. "Mr. Ashford, did you forge your mother's signature on legal documents?" "Those were drafts. I was just practicing." "Practicing forgery?" "Practicing helping her with paperwork when she was ready." It was painful to watch, even for someone who had orchestrated his downfall. The brilliant attorney I had raised was reduced to stammering excuses and transparent lies as the weight of his crimes became undeniable. The closing arguments were masterful pieces of legal theater. Rebecca systematically destroyed any sympathy the jury might have felt for Grant, emphasizing that he had planned to profit from threatening his own mother's life. "This defendant," she said, pointing directly at Grant, "held his dying mother hostage while demanding she rewrite her will. When that didn't work, he forged her signature. When the banks caught him, he violated a restraining order to try again. This is not a family dispute. This is a criminal who happens to be related to his victim." David Walsh made a valiant but futile attempt to generate sympathy for his client, arguing that Grant had been driven to desperate measures by financial pressure and family dysfunction. "Grant Ashford made mistakes," Walsh concluded, "but this prosecution has been driven by vindictiveness rather than justice. Don't let an angry mother use the criminal justice system to punish her son for disappointing her." It was a dangerous argument that only served to remind the jury of exactly what Grant had done to earn my anger. After just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. "On the charge of attempted grand larceny in the first degree, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty." "On the charge of forgery in the second degree, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty." "On the charge of elder abuse in the first degree, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty." The guilty verdicts continued through every charge. By the time the jury foreman finished reading, Grant had been convicted on all counts, a complete vindication of everything I had endured and everything I had fought to prove. Grant broke down completely as the verdicts were read, sobbing into his hands as the reality of life imprisonment finally hit him. His attorney tried to comfort him, but there was nothing left to say. As the bailiffs prepared to lead him away in shackles, Grant turned to look at me one final time. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for everything." I met his eyes with the same cold indifference I'd shown throughout the trial. "I know you are, Grant, but some things can't be forgiven, even with sorry." The courtroom erupted in applause as Grant was led away to begin serving his sentence. Judge Reeve had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Sentencing was scheduled for the following week, but everyone knew what it would be. The elder abuse conviction alone carried a mandatory minimum of 15 years, and the judge had broad discretion to impose consecutive rather than concurrent sentences. Judge Reeve's sentencing hearing took place exactly 1 week after the guilty verdicts, in the same packed courtroom where Grant had been convicted. I arrived wearing a burgundy suit with my pearl jewelry, ready to witness the final chapter of Grant's legal destruction. Our book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, contains powerful strategies for women who refuse to be victims. Like Penelope, you have the strength to turn your pain into power, your betrayal into triumph. Don't let anyone convince you that your best days are behind you. They're not. Click the link in the description and discover how to reclaim your life today. Judge Reeve was known for his thorough sentencing statements, and he didn't disappoint. Before imposing sentence, he delivered a scathing assessment of Grant's crimes that left no doubt about his feelings regarding elder abuse. "Mr. Ashford," Judge Reeve began, looking directly at my son, "in my 25 years on the bench, I have never encountered a case that more clearly illustrates the depths of family betrayal and financial exploitation. You threatened to let your own mother die unless she enriched you. When that failed, you forged her signature and attempted to steal her life savings." Grant sat slumped in his chair, unable to meet the judge's eyes. "You are hereby sentenced to 20 years in state prison on the elder abuse conviction, 15 years on the attempted grand larceny conviction to run consecutively, and 10 years on the forgery conviction to run concurrently. Total sentence, 35 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Grant's remaining composure finally shattered. He collapsed forward, his body shaking with sobs as the reality of spending the rest of his productive life in prison became undeniable. Additionally, Judge Reeve continued, "You are ordered to pay full restitution to Mrs. Ashford in the amount of $750,000, representing her legal fees, security costs, and emotional damages." The restitution was largely symbolic. Grant would never have the means to pay such an amount from prison. But it served to emphasize the court's recognition of the harm he had caused. As the bailiffs prepared to lead Grant away for the final time, he turned to look at me one last time. "This isn't over," he whispered, though his voice carried no conviction. "Yes, it is," I replied quietly. "It's been over since the moment you chose money over family." Outside the courthouse, I made my final statement to the assembled media. "Justice has been served today," I told the reporters. "My son chose greed over love, money over morality. The court has ensured that choice has consequences that will last the rest of his life." 6 months later, I stood in my renovated breakfast room, looking out at the gardens Thomas and I had planted together decades ago. The crown molding where I'd hidden the camera that caught Grant's threat had been replaced, but I'd kept the surveillance system. Trust, once broken, was never fully restored. The civil case had concluded with a complete victory. Grant's assets had been seized to pay my legal fees, and the no-contest clause in my estate plan had been upheld. He would inherit nothing, even if he somehow survived his prison sentence. Sloane's divorce had been finalized quickly, with her claiming she'd been an innocent victim of Grant's deception. She'd moved back to her hometown, changing her name and trying to rebuild her reputation. I felt no sympathy for her. She'd been a willing participant in Grant's schemes until the consequences became real. My estate planning was now ironclad. Arthur had restructured everything to ensure that no future challenges could threaten my intentions. The Ashford Heritage Trust would continue operating long after my death, supporting causes I believed in rather than enriching people who had betrayed me. I'd also established a fund to train bank employees and legal professionals to recognize signs of elder financial abuse. It was a fitting legacy, using my experience to protect other elderly people from the kind of exploitation Grant had attempted. The house felt different now, cleaner somehow, as if Grant's evil intentions had been purged along with his physical presence. I'd redecorated his old bedroom, turning it into a reading room filled with the books I'd always meant to explore. From prison, Grant had sent several letters over the months, all of which I returned unopened. Arthur logged each one as refused delivery for our legal records, but I had no interest in his words. Everything he needed to say to me had been said in my breakfast room that terrible morning, and everything I needed to say to him had been said in court. On the first anniversary of his sentencing, I did something I'd been planning for months. I visited the storage unit where I'd kept family photographs and removed every picture that included Grant. Not to erase the memories, I would never forget what had happened, but to acknowledge that the relationship was permanently severed. The photographs went into a fireproof safe along with the evidence from his case. Future historians studying my family would understand exactly why Grant Ashford had been written out of the Ashford legacy. That evening, I hosted a quiet dinner party for Arthur, Maureen, Trent, and Detective Spader, the team that had helped me achieve justice. We celebrated not just Grant's conviction, but the system that had worked exactly as intended to protect elderly victims from financial exploitation. You know, Arthur said as we finished our dessert, this case will be studied in law schools for decades. It's a perfect example of how to build an airtight elder abuse prosecution. Good, I replied. If my experience helps protect other families from this kind of betrayal, then something positive will have come from Grant's crimes. Detective Spader raised his glass in a toast. To Penelope Ashford, who proved that age is not vulnerability, it's weaponized wisdom. As my guests left that night, I stood in my foyer looking at the security monitor that showed my empty driveway. The house was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet rather than a lonely one. I was alone by choice now, not by circumstance. I had proven that a 64-year-old woman could outthink, outmaneuver, and ultimately destroy an opponent who had underestimated her completely. Grant had thought he could pressure me into compliance, threaten me into submission, manipulate me into surrender. Instead, he had awakened something in me that I hadn't known existed, a capacity for strategic thinking and methodical revenge that would have impressed Sun to sue himself. The next morning brought another beautiful spring day, crisp and clear with the promise of renewal in the air. I dressed carefully in a navy suit and my pearl jewelry, then drove to the courthouse where I was scheduled to speak at a conference on financial crimes against the elderly. Standing before an audience of prosecutors, investigators, and advocates, I told my story not as a victim, but as a survivor who had refused to accept defeat. Ladies and gentlemen, I concluded my presentation. Age does not make us helpless. Experience does not make us weak. And when someone tries to destroy us, we have every right to destroy them first, legally, systematically, and completely. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but more importantly, I saw understanding in the faces of people who worked every day to protect elderly victims from financial exploitation. Driving home that afternoon, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed. A year ago, I had been a trusting mother who believed family bonds were sacred. Now I was a woman who had proven that survival was possible even in the face of ultimate betrayal. That evening, I sat in my study writing in the journal I'd kept throughout this ordeal. The final entry was simple but profound. Grant thought he could write the ending to my story by threatening my life for money. Instead, I wrote his ending, 35 years in prison where he'll spend every day regretting the moment he decided to cross Penelope Ashford. I survived his greed, his threats, and his betrayal. I turned his weapons against him and emerged victorious. At 64, I discovered strengths I never knew I possessed and learned lessons that will serve me for whatever years remain. Some might say revenge is beneath a lady of my age and station. They're wrong. When revenge is justice, when it protects others from similar harm, when it empowers the victim to reclaim their dignity, then revenge is not just acceptable, it's mandatory. Grant wanted my fortune? He got exactly what he deserved. Nothing but the knowledge that his greed destroyed everything he ever had or could have. I write my own ending, and it's a masterpiece. I closed the journal and placed it in my safe, alongside all the evidence that had brought Grant to justice. Someday, perhaps, it would serve as a cautionary tale for other families about the corrosive power of greed. Outside my window, the spring evening was peaceful and full of promise. Inside my house, I was alone but triumphant, surrounded by the life I had built and defended with everything I possessed. Grant had tried to reduce me to a stepping stone on his path to wealth. Instead, he had become the foundation of my greatest victory, and that victory would last the rest of my life. If Penelope's story resonates with you, you're not alone. Every day, women are told they're too old to fight back, too trusting to protect themselves, too fragile to stand up to those who would exploit them. These are lies designed to keep you powerless and vulnerable. The truth is that your age is your greatest asset. Your experience is your armor. Your survival instincts are weapons that younger people haven't had time to forge. You are not a victim waiting to happen. You are a force that should never be underestimated. Our best-selling book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, contains the strategies and mindset shifts that women like Penelope use to transform betrayal into triumph. Whether you're dealing with financial exploitation, family manipulation, or any situation where someone has mistaken your kindness for weakness, this book will show you how to reclaim your power and demand the respect you deserve. Don't spend another day accepting less than your worth. Don't let anyone convince you that your story is over or that you should quietly accept mistreatment for the sake of family peace. Click the link in the description box right now and order Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain. Your transformation starts today. Remember, justice isn't always about forgiveness. Sometimes it's about ensuring that the right people pay the right price for their choices. And women of our generation, we know exactly how to collect what's owed. Like this video if you believe in holding people accountable for their actions, regardless of blood relations. Subscribe for more stories of women who refused to be victims and became architects of justice instead. And share this with any woman who needs to remember that betrayal is not a life sentence. It's a test of character that reveals who deserves to remain in your life.